No one's saying don't talk about controversial issues. No one's saying don't talk about social issues and the scientific research that goes into that. You're just approaching it from one worldview and one perspective when there's actually quite a lot of them out there. That, I think, is actually the real criticism. So while I was away on travel last week, I missed a few things. I'm catching up a little bit. And this one crossed my radar. From reading it before, it seems that Scientific American has taken note of the criticisms that it has gotten political. And so, ironically, they dropped this on election day in the United States. Which I don't know if that was intended or not, to be honest. But it's very interesting. And I don't necessarily agree with the opening statement here. Every story is a science story. Because if you know, watch this channel in a few videos past, I have critiqued Scientific American, Science, and Nature for all freaking out for the same reason, claiming that the Supreme Court is anti-science when it quite obviously forgets that the role of the Supreme Court is quite different from the role and purpose of scientists. And so it's important to get into that. And so this is actually fairly short editorial, but I do have a lot of thoughts on it. So I will try and keep this brief, but I do think it is worth going through to make a point here because, I don't agree that every story is a science story in this. And I think to a degree it misses the mark, actually, as to why the criticism has come at Scientific American. Critics sometimes tell us that Scientific American has strayed from what might be called classical science content and is wading into subject areas where we don't belong. This claim bubbles up most often when we publish stories related to social justice or human rights, on the research supporting healthcare for transgender people, for instance, or abortion as basic medical care. Abortion is not basic medical care, but that's a whole other thing. A Twitter user replied to an opinion piece against forcing trans girls to play on boys' sports teams by writing, quote, "You should probably move everything back to science, facts, and stats and leave the..." Did you really misspell wokeness? All of you on the editorial board wrote that and you didn't correct it? I hope... I mean, maybe it's wrong that you... Okay, in fairness, that may have been the way the Twitter guy wrote it, in which case that was a Twitter typo, that they translated the quote accurately. Could be that. Leave the wokeness, narrative skewing, and agenda setting behind. It's not good for your credibility. And in response to a recent job listing that described our commitment to diversity and inclusion, someone else tweeted, "Advancing DEI and social justice is not something any truth-seeking institution or organization should prioritize." Okay. So obviously they're upset. These detractors are telling us to stay in our lane, that scientific inquiry is a pure, clean, completely objective enterprise, and that what we publish should be devoid of politics or the perspectives of people who are affected by the culture of scientific research. But the truth is that science is relevant to every element of society, including policy and politics. Now, latter statement, I do not actually disagree. Scientific research is very important to policy making, and this gets it to the point of where I think the editors miss the mark of why they're getting criticized. The purpose, at least in my humble opinion, as you've followed on this channel a few times, the fundamental purpose of science is the pursuit of the truth. Therefore, when you get into the point of, okay, you are interested in one political perspective over another and advancing that particular political perspective over another, you have a decreased incentive to focus on what the truth is around a matter and an increased incentive to focus on things that promote your particular political agenda. That is different to actually doing research doing research and doing scientific studies to the benefit, not to the benefit of, to inform policy and politics. That's two different things. Because if you're doing it to inform, then in your regard for the pursuit of the truth, you actually do have to, at times, tell the policymaker, no, I don't think this is well, not that I don't think this is a good idea, but in a way, whether or not, if you can model it, analyze it, basic physical reasoning, what have you, tell them that that policy just won't work, frankly, and you do have to push back on politics. There's one reason we supposedly have in the different agencies in the federal government in the United States that are connected with science, we have scientific integrity officers. It is precisely for this reason, because although the federal government funds scientific research to quite a tune of many $billions per year, it is not the job of the government to dictate what that research is, well, not what that research is precisely, but how that research should be done or the conclusions that should be reached. It is not the job of the federal government to do that, regardless. Now, why do I say dictate what the research is? Because the federal agencies can set what their research priorities are. That does necessitate, to a certain degree, if you're not meeting the priorities when you put in a grant proposal to a particular agency, yes, you're less likely to get funded. That's a reality of dealing with scientific research. It's the nature of the beast there. But yeah, I'm sorry. This is where there's a difference. And I don't necessarily disagree. Scientific American is being somewhat honest. At least the editors here are being somewhat honest. Publication committed to explaining the world around us, that means every lane is our lane. No, if you're focused on scientific research and science, your lane is not law. Your lane is not philosophy. Your lane is not ethics. Well, I mean, scientific ethics for sure, but not necessarily the larger scale religiosity or what have you. Save for those studies that study it. But it is not your prerogative, per se, to push a particular view of that, save for one that is based on what studies suggest. Now, there's where is the fine line. My question, always with Scientific American, is it about the research on these topics that you're talking about, or is it framed in such a manner that you're promoting a particular view of the world? In which case, I would say you don't have very much of a commitment to diversity, because you're not necessarily examining the studies that might contradict your own worldview, and not necessarily considering the studies that might contradict your own worldview. Hence, one of the reasons I find this a very fascinating thing, for example. And so I think they missed the mark here, in that one of the reasons they're getting the criticism, and I think, in my humble opinion, very justified criticism, is that you are appearing biased toward one particular worldview, rather than actually promoting scientific studies and research that may may favor a different worldview. Because science is about the pursuit of the truth and what have you, you're going to get things in studies that contradict your own worldview at times, that present data that contradicts your worldview and how you would like the world to be, or in other words, contradict your own values at times, or appear to contradict your own values. And if you're being honest about that, then there are studies that do end up presenting something that folks don't want to hear, be it right or left, politically. That is where the criticism is, in my observation of the criticism and Scientific American's response to it, is that, yeah, you can talk about any controversial issue you'd like. That's not the issue. The issue is the framing of the matter as such, as being based on a singular worldview. Now, I don't have a problem with that, if you're being honest with the audience. I don't think Scientific American is necessarily being honest with their audience in what their preferred worldview is amongst the editorial board, amongst the writers, and what have you. Um, but such is. Using data-driven reasoning and analysis, science doesn't solve anything, for crying out loud. Science studies do. Many studies present a lot of the solutions to some of these problems, giving us answers to major societal questions. For instance, after sequencing the human genome in 2001, the researchers who analyzed our strings of genetic code show there was no significant differences among human categories corresponding to racial categories. This has helped change the narrative around the inherent meaning of race that is a social construct, not a biological one. Indeed. The landmark Turnaway study from the University of California, San Francisco, revealed the long-term effects of abortion. Anti-abortion activists claim that people who get the procedure suffer from, oh boy, you're showing a singular study for one thing. There's often many studies, and if we're going by the network actor thing here, you're selecting one actor in the network, but that's a whole other thing. Researchers found the opposite. Following 1,000 pregnant women who either received an abortion or denied one, scientists found women who could not access abortion services suffered negative after effects. This included financial problems, lower educational attainment, more physical and health problems compared to women who were able to get an abortion. The medical procedure, politicized by people who believe that the woman... That is not the pro-life argument. I gotta say right there, you're not representing pro-life argument fairly. That is not accurate at all. And this is not the place to get into that, which is why I'm not going to do that right now. But I will say the editors of Scientific American, that is not saying that politicized by people who believe that women should not be in control of their own bodies is not a fair representation of the argument of pro-life people or pro-life groups. Recent featured article we published challenged some of the popular perception that Viking culture as male first might always... Michelle, I think I'm pronouncing that wrong, I apologize, Hayer-Smith, an anthropological archaeologist at Brown University, found that Viking women controlled the production of tradable textiles, making them economic leaders in societies that is romanticized by white supremacists and incels, which stands for involuntary celibates, and as identity claimed by misogynist groups. I'm going to make a note that there's no citation for that latter half of the sentence, which is notable considering that you are making a statement of fact. Science should illuminate controversial topics, and it is part of our mission to share the evidence relevant to important social issues. Back to my main point. One of the reasons why people are being very critical of you, Scientific American, is because you seem to be only sharing evidence that supports a particular worldview. You don't seem to be interested in looking at any of the evidence that perhaps contradicts that worldview. You also don't seem to be, if you're going to be getting into some of the moral issues, examining the moral issues that comes from the other side of the argument or from a different worldview. Which is, a short way I can say it, is for all the interest in diversity and inclusion here, there's very little diversity of thought that seems to come up in Scientific American nowadays. Which is one of the reasons why so many people are getting turned off. At least from what I find, and I'm still a young scientist technically in my own field, and aside from glancing at Scientific American every so often, I don't read it anymore because it is so dedicated to stuff that is coming at it from one particular worldview. I really don't get a whole lot of diversity of thought. And that's actually what I really crave when I read publications from scientific stuff when you're talking about different issues and what have you. No one ever said. I don't know if anybody who said specifically you can't talk about that issue. That's false framing. It's more so the issue of, something. It's more so the issue of you're talking about it solely from one particular view. You're not making the point of actually getting at the truth, which requires divergent viewpoints. It doesn't require coming at it from a singular perspective. And I don't disagree. Science should illuminate controversial topics. I don't disagree, actually, with that. But you also have to be willing to work based on the truth and be pursuing the truth. That is the concern again. Are you approaching things from a particular viewpoint, as opposed to actually trying to look at a diverse set of perspectives and the evidence from those diverse set of perspectives. I rarely see that when I read Scientific American anymore. There is rarely actually consideration, or there's a consideration of like the pro-life position before, where they were just demeaned as all people who just want to control a woman's body. That's not really representing that statement in and of itself is a good example and reason why you're getting criticized, Scientific American, but you just didn't see it. I'm reminded when I read this of the interview on Joe Rogan with Tim Pool and Jack Dorsey on Vijaya God, when they were talking about the rules for Twitter. And Tim was elucidating in the interview, in the back and forth, actually, it was a discussion, how your rules themselves are biased against a different worldview in Twitter. It's a similar kind of thing that that seems to be, it appears to me to be what's happening here, where they just like seem to be approaching it from a particular worldview and not realizing that that's not their own necessarily. Oh, goodness. In 2020, the editors of Scientific American endorsed Joe Biden for president. A Twitter user said, quote, "Getting political means getting biased, and a magazine that has scientific in its name should not be biased." In truth, we have a long history of weighing in on divisive political issues. In 1950, the magazine was set to publish an article written by physicist Hans Bethe, who had worked on the Manhattan Project, that was critical of the development of the hydrogen bomb. When the Federal Atomic Energy Commission got wind of the manuscript, agents burned all 3,000 copies of the issue that contained the article. More than 30 years later, we published technical criticisms, also by Bethe and other physicists, of a space-based missile defense system known as Star Wars. Star Wars was during the Reagan administration. Okay. This is the thing. Weighing in on divisive political issues. No one's saying not to weigh in on divisive political issues. I don't have a problem with Scientific American talking about abortion, climate change, the social sciences, and things along that line of psychology and what have you, and talking about the disparities between groups and all that. I don't have a problem with that. It's that first part that everybody had a problem with. You endorsed a candidate for president, which signals perhaps that you are endorsing a particular worldview over another, which is not really in line with pursuing the truth necessarily. Nobody has a problem with talking about divisive political issues and weighing in on them. Those are two different things, and you're trying to equate them as the same thing when that's not accurate. Science offers voters, policymakers, and political leaders indispensable insight into the best course of action. Conversely, governing also involves political decisions about science. Oh boy. The executive and legislative branches determine budgetary allotments for billions of dollars in medical research and technological innovation for the energy sector, military tools, healthcare, food security, national infrastructure, and education. Perhaps as a reflection of this close relationship, a record number of candidates with STEM backgrounds are running for political office this year, according to the Political Action Committee 314 Action Fund. They are meteorologists, doctors, and many others, aiming to apply their expertise in scientific thinking to policymaking. Okay. Science is the pursuit of the truth. So, in a way, yes, it does offer some indispensable insight because you can see relationships between things, you can illuminate physical processes, make conclusions about how the physical world works, and other things. However, where this is a problem is that it is not the only thing that's involved in decision making. This is blurring the line between the pursuit of the truth and providing the evidence for different physical processes and what have you, relevant applied research for any number of policies and things like that, and the actual political parts running for office. It's not quite scientism, which is the irrational belief that science can answer all questions when it can't. And what I mean by answer all questions when it can is like you think it can answer the moral, the philosophical, the spiritual questions and things like that. Science cannot do that. So providing scientific evidence for something, providing data and analysis for something is a single part of what makes a decision. For example, there's an entire process called structured decision making, whereby you can incorporate both the data from scientific studies on climate hydrology, social effects, things like that, and also incorporate the fundamental objectives and competing objectives that are based on multiple different value systems. There are ways to do that. It's actually a very nice, handy structured approach, and that's not the only one. There are many, many different kinds of approaches like that. And in policy making, those kinds of things outnumber the evidentiary of the scientific process. They honestly really do. Now, they're not wrong also about the idea that, political decisions about science, because, unfortunately, the heads of NOAA, NSF, all the rest are appointed by the president, by the sitting president, and so set the agenda alongside many committees and what have you. It's a very long and complicated process sometimes just to set a strategic plan and determine funding priorities. Because when every agency puts out their call for proposals or things like that, they are essentially saying, these are the things we want to fund research on right now. That is not always dictated. You would hope that was dictated by scientific practice, but it is not always the case. Yeah. I don't necessarily disagree. The other thing is perhaps as a reflection, it's not a reflection of that close relationship. Truthfully, it's not. Because you've had that relationship for however many years, and why is it happening now that many are running? Hi, darling. I've got a cat rubbing my legs. So I don't necessarily think so, but I'd have to think on that one more. That's not as important to me as other things in this article. Telling us, or scientists, or other science writers, hold on a second, I gotta scroll down here, to stay in our lane is a tactic to silence people with relevant expertise from weighing in on divisive issues. Stay in our lane. Yeah, that's not the reason people are criticizing you. I'm sure there's some that would be just like, well, shut up, you're the scientist. Fair. That's probably true. There are some. However, my biggest criticism and critique is because all of it, every single thing when you're weighing in on it, is coming from a singular worldview and perspective, which indicates there's an ideological bent, which indicates that Scientific American is biased, which is fine. I would prefer that you admit that you're biased. That's what I would prefer, Scientific American. In some cases, the criticism attempts to maintain the power of wealthy, white, male members of society. So, I'm not wealthy and I'm not a man. Not maintaining my power in this situation. Good grief. Ad hominems on that. Ad hominems. Lots of ad hominems. And again, I go back to this comment here. This medical procedure politicized by people who believe that women should not be in control of their bodies. Total misrepresentation of the pro-life position. Didn't even bother to check on that. That right there is an emblematic statement of why so many people are starting to think you're very biased. That is the reason why that is an emblematic of why. It's certainly not the only reason, but it is emblematic of why Scientific American has been getting criticized. This criticism comes most often when we report on science relevant to the health and well-being of disempowered groups, suggesting it is not a pure rejection of the fact that there is science behind social issues. Science is everywhere. That's very creepy because you're treating science as a religion just by saying that. But anyway, or at least Science is everywhere. Yeah, that is really creepy as a line. I'm sorry. As a scientist, that one rubs me the wrong way. And we at Scientific American are going to cover the science relevant to social justice and the most vital questions facing humanity. Jonathan Haidt wrote for the Heterodox blog that you can only have one telos for the university, truth or social justice. You can't have two. The unfortunate thing about this is I don't think Scientific American has forgotten that. Now, as I said, the criticism here is not that Scientific American is talking about divisive issues. I don't have a problem with that, and I'm one of the people criticizing them. The issue is that it is entirely coming from singular worldview. There's very, very, very little diversity, and if the editors of Scientific American are willing to treat those of the opposing argument with ad hominems and false representation of the arguments of the opposing party, do you wonder why? You tend to have a lot of bias, or not. You tend to have a lot of bias, but you tend to be viewed as very biased. Scientific American, you're not publishing anything that has a different worldview from what is most commonly considered to be on the political left in the United States now. And that is where people have a problem with you as being considered biased. And ironically enough, it came out in this article with the representation of anybody who's criticizing Scientific American being considered maintaining the power of wealthy white. That's not why I'm criticizing you. Frankly, I'm criticizing you because I'm disappointed in the quality of the work. And one of the reasons I'm disappointed in the quality of the work is you don't have a diversity of thought represented at Scientific American. It's absolutely stunning to me that for an entity that now writes on so much on diversity, that diversity of thought gets thrown out the bus. And one of the reasons I don't think very highly of Scientific American at all, and it's one of the reasons at least vast majority of scientists I've talked to in my own sphere, both online and in person, don't think very highly of Scientific American anymore. And it's not because of weighing in on divisive issues. It's because you have no diversity of thought. It's coming from one ideological worldview. Which, again, I wouldn't necessarily have a problem with that if that was the honest... if the editors here were being honest. As to the thing at the beginning, and I'll wrap this up in a moment, every story is a science story. Science is about the pursuit of the truth. And as I said at the beginning, I've talked previously about how Scientific American, Science, and Nature, all three of them pretty much freaked out around the three cases heard by the Supreme Court, the Dobbs decision, the EPA decision, and the New York gun decision. No, not every story is a science story. They were commenting on the court cases. And here's the thing, they were commenting on the court cases, but talking about it as if Scientific American, as though the SCOTUS majority in those cases was just anti-science. Didn't even bother, didn't care. Totally missing the point that the purpose of the Supreme Court is not the analysis and evidence that comes with science. It is a question of whether or not something is lawful under the Constitution. For one, whether or not abortion is a human right. That is the purview of the Supreme Court. That is not the purview of scientists, necessarily. Now, scientists can have opinions on it, and they can weigh in on it. Perfectly fine. You got your freedom of speech. Do it. The same thing with the EPA case. It was a question of whether or not the federal government had the authority to do what it did. That is not a science question. That is a law and policy question. Two different things. So that's not a science story. It's related to science. Yeah, it's related to scientific research and climate change. Totally fair. But the story itself, that's not a science story. The gun law, for instance. Okay. The question in that case was whether or not New York State's gun law on concealed carry was a violation of the Second Amendment. That's what the court found, is that it was a violation of the fundamental right to defend yourself in the Second Amendment. That is also not a science question. It's not a science question in the slightest. It is a legal policy question. That's my point when I say that not every story is a science story at all. It might be a legal story, it might be a philosophical story, it might be a moral story, might be an ethics related story, and maybe one that has had nothing to do with scientific ethics. Could be two different things. Overall, though, I think it's unfortunate that the editors missed the mark of why myself and others have been criticizing them. And it's quite often because they really don't, for all of their claims for being about the truth, they forget one thing that is so important in going after the truth, and that's actually having a diversity of perspectives. Because there's so much that comes out of Scientific American now that is pretty much focused from a singular worldview. No one's saying don't talk about controversial issues. No one's saying don't talk about social issues and the scientific research that goes into that. You're just approaching it from one worldview and one perspective when there's actually quite a lot of them out there. That, I think, is actually the real criticism. Not what Scientific American is saying. I think Scientific American is saying, yeah, everybody's just telling us to stay in our lane and we're not going to do that. Yeah, these detractors. I would like to see the quotes of people who've said you should stay in your lane. So, yeah, I don't necessarily agree with this. Like I said, I don't have a problem with you talking about controversial issues. I got a problem with it when there's no diversity of thought. That's it for now. Let me know what you think. Hit the like button on the way out the door, comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that lovely good jazz, and until next time, I'm Adrian. Stay curious.